Grace to you all this morning, and peace from God our Father, and from our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. This question appears a number of times in our readings for this morning. The question, who are you? In the reading from Acts, Paul asks it of this mysterious presence that comes to him on the road to Damascus. In our reading from John's Gospel, none of the disciples dare to ask that question because they believe they know who it really is, finally, in a moment of revelation. Who are you? It's a tough question, isn't it? Ever think about that question, who are you? Meet somebody new and they want to know something about you. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Who are you? And sometimes we struggle to define ourselves based on the context that we're in. In my experience, and this is a generalization, so I hope you'll accept it as that. In my experience, generally speaking, men will describe who they are based on what they do. And women will describe who they are based on their relationships. So if you ask a man, who are you? He says, well, I'm the pastor, I'm a Lutheran pastor. And a woman will say, well, I'm married, I have 3 kids, I have 6 grandchildren. Just an interesting difference that we have, how we describe ourselves based on either what we do or to whom we are related. Who are you? Who are you? What's so fascinating about that question is that on a certain level, we're not anybody at all, right? We just kind of put all those definitions on top of ourselves to begin to find some sense of identity for ourselves. But none of those definitions, either through work or relationships, are finally definitive of who you are. As much as they may give us a sense of purpose or give us a sense of connection, all those things can change. I think that's why especially men have a hard time with retirement. Because for the past 30 or 40 years, they've defined themselves by what they do, and then all of a sudden retirement comes and they're not doing it anymore. So who are you? Well, I used to be a doctor, I used to be a lawyer, I used to be a plumber, I used to be a conductor on Metro North. Well, who are you now? Right? It's a challenge, whereas the more permanence that comes with defining yourself by relationship can help a little bit, because those relationships continue even though they change. But still, who are you? How do you define yourself? How do you locate yourself in place in society and culture in the world? It's a good question to think about every now and then. I was thinking this morning about Sonia's baby, Duran, and he's sort of, it's kind of cool because he could be whoever he wants to be. He doesn't have that much of a definition yet. And when we have babies, there's so much potential there, so much unrealized potential. And sometimes when they have to make choices and define themselves more specifically as we grow up, and that's a necessity, there's a little bit of regret about that, because when you make one choice, you're eliminating a whole bunch of other choices of who you could be or what you could do or how you could define yourself. And you're closing off some other opportunities, perhaps. But when you're born, you're just like tons of potential. You could be anything at all. Who do you become? What choices do you make? Well, we all make choices. We all begin to define ourselves in one way or another. And sometimes the question for us is, how much of that self-definition do we take seriously as an ultimate definition, and how much of it do we see as just a particular choice or an option for our life at this particular time? St. Paul had defined himself in a particular way, a very particular way, as a good, and he refers to this again in his letters, as a good, staunch follower of the Jewish faith. So faithful to the roots of his religion that when some people deviated from that, he saw them as heretical, who needed to be punished and brought back into line, namely the Christians, who claimed audaciously that the Messiah had come. And somehow, because they defined themselves that way, Paul felt his own identity as a Jew challenged. And so what he felt was necessary was to bring them back into line to secure his own identity once again. And to keep the religion pure. To keep the religion pure. Unfortunately, what happened, and we talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago, unfortunately what happened in that desire to have a pure identity was that he punished other people. In an attempt to define himself, he forced other people into a definition that they were not willing to accept. And so immersed was he in this effort that he needed to be woken up. He needed to be challenged in his sense of identity. And sure enough, as he's carrying out this mission on the road to Damascus, Jesus appears to him and says to him, "Why do you persecute me?" And Saul, who will soon become Paul, asks that question, "Who are you?" And what's fascinating about this encounter between Jesus and Paul is that Paul begins to understand who he is once he understands who Jesus is. By being able to answer that question over the next several days and years, Paul begins to be able to define himself in a different way than he had before, because he has this encounter with the risen Christ who changes his identity as Paul. In fact, we have that name change from Saul to Paul. Who are you? I was reminded also of the scene from the movie Shrek. I don't know how many of you have seen Shrek. Interesting movie. But you've seen it? It's a cool movie, right? I don't know if you remember that scene where Shrek has just freed Donkey and they're walking through the field together and discussing next steps. And Donkey says to Shrek, "Well, you know, it's your swamp. You should just do ogreish things to get it back." And Shrek says, "Well, like what kind of ogreish things do you have in mind?" And Donkey mentions a couple things and says, "You know, ogres are much more complicated than that." Right? Ogre, like, there you go. Ogres are much more complicated than that. Ogres are more like onions. They have layers. You remember this scene? Ogres are like onions. They have layers. And you don't always behave in one way. Sometimes there are multiple layers to how you might want to engage the world, who you might want to be. And Donkey isn't too excited by this idea because he really doesn't like onions, so he begins to suggest to Shrek other possible understandings. He says, maybe you could be like cake. Cake has layers. Or how about parfait? Parfait has layers. That's one of my favorite lines. But there's this idea that we're not who we always seem to be on the surface, that we are very intricate, very detailed people, very complicated, perhaps some of our own selves unknown even to ourselves, because there are so many layers to who we are. But that kind of just delays the question, right? This kind of puts off the question of who you are. How do you define yourself? Where do you find your sense of meaning and purpose? The disciples, men of their time, some of them defined themselves by their occupation. We're fishermen. That's what we do. And after all the turmoil in Jerusalem and the crucifixion of Jesus, and even after a couple of resurrection appearances, they begin to understand more who Jesus is, especially in that famous encounter between Jesus and Thomas, who makes this wonderful statement, "My Lord and my God." They begin to understand a little bit more who Jesus is, but so far they haven't quite figured out who they are. So in this final chapter of John's Gospel, we find 7 of those disciples back in Galilee getting ready to go and fishing again. And like the first time that they met Jesus, their fishing expedition is unsuccessful. They have caught nothing. But they're doing the best they can because they don't know what to do now that all this drama has taken place in their life. They don't know what it means. So they're falling back into an old, familiar definition. They're fishermen. Maybe on that particular night, not very good fishermen, but we're trying. Until Jesus appears on the shore and calls to them, and unused to resurrection, especially there in Galilee, they do not recognize him. Until he suggests that they take the net out of one side of the boat, drop it down on the other, and the catch of fish is so enormous they can barely haul it to shore. And then they remember that first call. Then they remember how transformed their lives were by their encounter with Christ. for 3 years. Then they remember that they too were given a new identity, just as Christ got a new identity through resurrection, got a new understanding of his identity for the people to see. And then one of the disciples, this mysterious disciple, funny that we should be talking about identity and have this disciple who is never defined in John's gospel other than the one whom Jesus loved, says to Peter, "It's the Lord." And Peter jumps into the water and swims to shore because he wants to be with Jesus. He leaves the boat behind for a little bit so that he can remember who he really is, so that he can find himself redefined in terms of relationship. That is, relationship with Jesus. I want to suggest to you that the reason that we're gathered together this morning, no matter what your week has looked like, no matter how busy or crazy you've been or how relaxed it's been, no matter what your highs or lows, I want to suggest to you that the reason we're gathered together this morning is because we have something in common. We have a common identity. We are the same people. We are God's baptized children. That our identity comes through the waters of the fonts, through the waters of baptism, in which we are there claimed by God, and we make this commitment, this promise at that moment, that God will never leave us or forsake us. And that our fundamental identity comes through the waters of baptism. That we are God's children. And that however else we choose to define ourselves along the way, hopefully with a spirit of freedom and grace, we know and remember that we belong to God. And that that's important because God is the one who has power over our lives. Not just here and now, not just for the length of our days, but into eternity. That fundamentally who we are God's baptized people. That scene from Revelation is intriguing, isn't it? Myriads and myriads, thousands and thousands gathered around the throne, praising God and singing and worshiping there. And notice that they're not grouped together. Notice that John the Divine doesn't say, and the lawyers were over here, and the plumbers were over here, and the electricians were fixing the lighting in the back. And John doesn't say that. John says that there were just this great company of people praising God whose identity seemed to be in the community of the faithful gathered together praising. That's who they were. That's what they did. Because that's who God made them to be. In relationship with God. For God's sake and for theirs. So I pray that you have a little bit of time to reflect on these readings and how they make an impact on your own sense of self. On the fact that your identity, who you are, is really rooted in who God is. And that your identity comes from that birth. The birth through the waters of baptism, in which God claims you, and which will be your final identity when all other identities are washed away. You belong to God. That will never change. That is who you are.